My name is Tom Tate. I've really enjoyed being at the forums with you, Will. It's been just a great pleasure for me.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned on Monday at the forum about Iran and your experience in Iran. And I think that's, for a lot of people, this is one of these countries that is a rising power, at least a regional power. And I wondered what you see, what is the role of Iran and the U.S. in the next 5, 10, 20 years? How do you see that coming out? And how do we go about relations with Iran?
First, let me just describe my experiences in Iran so people might have an understanding of where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
I was working for a company called Fluor Corporation who were building a refinery in Iran. Interestingly enough, right next to a plant that the Russians were building for nuclear power. So we were deeply involved in what was happening in a modernized Iran. We had the pleasure of living there for a couple of years. Our children graduated from high school, from an Iranian high school.
Wow.
As a result, we had many, many friends, people I worked with, people we lived with that were Iranian, and we had a great opportunity to share with them their views about the United States and our views about, and of course we still think of it as Persia. When we talk about power, the power of Persia was non-exceeded at one time. And of course, the fact that the Iranians do not have that power, it comes up, the question comes up, we were once great. And to an extent, sometimes they will say, be watchful, it may happen to you. And they don't do it in a way to discourage us or anything. They're just saying to us, the young people in this continent, be cautious.
Right.
We found the Iranian people wonderful. We were often at dinner, at plays, at major occasions, and they would be very careful to explain to us what was happening and why and so forth.
Yeah. You were there in a very transitional time, as you explained. I know from my understanding of the Gulf that 1971, with the British withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971 and the U.S. Gulf Strategic Framework in 1979, that whole period, I think you said you were there in 76 and 77.
77 and 78.
Okay, and right before the downfall. And I guess my question to you is, that was a time of transition. We're now in a time of transition. How do you see, is there something to have learned from that transition?
I sincerely hope so, because we are in a transition just as much as the Iranians are. In any time there is transition, there is apprehension, there is great fear. We were there at the time when the Shah was overthrown. The revolution started before we left.
Wow.
My wife used to go to the market and walk over tanks and what have you. We've had bullets come through our windows. That just made my wife terribly angry. I came home after a meeting. She said, Tom, they're shooting. Let's go out and stop it. Very energetic lady. But the people themselves were deeply concerned. They felt that the Shah had perhaps exceeded the boundaries that they had given him. I went back after that period. I went back in 79 and left 5 days prior to the embassy takeover. How was I treated during that period when the Revolutionary Guards were in power? Respectful. I was a person contributing to their economy.
I see.
I was not a warrior. I was not a politician. I was essentially a contributor. And I felt that way, interestingly enough, in places that I've been as a military person on civic action activities. There is a respect when you contribute to the community. Don and I lived in the economy. We lived in a kuche, an alley, in a building. We shopped, and I hope the owner of this store will apologize, but we shopped at the dirty store. Because by our standards, it wasn't clean. Their refrigeration standards and so forth just aren't the same that we're used to. But they were wonderful people who cared for us and cared for our needs very, very well.
How might, in terms of, you mentioned there was apprehension, but you also said that there was mutual respect in a time of flux and apprehension at the same time. What might we learn from that experience in dealing with an Iran that seeks to have a more primary role in the region, if not the world? How do we deal with them
I
differently?
think it's a lesson that we have learned in our families, in our schools, and just as people in a community. We need to learn to listen.
Okay.
During periods of apprehension and fear, that's the most important time to listen.
Mm-hmm.
You found that out in your own family. When your children are uncomfortable, they're going to have to go to a new school, something's coming up that they don't know about, they need to be listened to and helped if you have the wisdom to do so.
Okay. What does it mean to acknowledge limits to power?
It is no different to admit a limit of power as a military force than it is, to a degree, as an individual. If you are humble and say, I am powerful, but I want to use my power in a different way, you have not lost anything. You've gained. You have certainly shown courage that is needed today. We find that in our industries. To be able to say, I'm manufacturing the wrong car. It's not for today. And be able to build a better car, a new car, is really effective use of power.
Okay.
My view of Vietnam is different than most people. I was in command of CB teams in Vietnam and Thailand. What did we do? We were small groups of armed, though very proficient construction people. We went into villages that were, for the most part, Vietnam held, or Viet Cong held. And we would help the villagers to learn how to build. We would help them build clinics, markets, roads, water system, put in wells, etc. These teams that are now called civic action teams are still in existence and still being used around the world.
Right.
This to me is a very effective way of the use of military power.
Okay.